All right, I think we are about ready to begin. I want to say good morning and good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast. I want to thank everyone who's attending our webinar. We have another great turnout for our latest presentation in the NIMBL lecture series. This one's going to be Splash and Build, learning about SAP's newest user experience solution. I'm Jake Eisbart, part of the NIMBL marketing team. A little bit about us. We are SAP technologists, NIMBL, and SAP ecosystem thought leaders. Our consulting business, which is 50% of our work, delivers SAP projects, both technical and functional, while our Denver-based SAP managed services, the other 50%, supports both Fortune 1000 and Midmarket 24/7 across 20-plus SAP skill sets. Here are a list of some of the services that we offer. Today we will be talking about UX and Splash and Build. And here are some of the customers that we work with and have worked with. Just a couple housekeeping items. We want to be able to answer as many questions as possible. So if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the chat box. Feel free to ask the questions, and our speaker, Mark, will address them at the end of the presentation. So let's get to it. Our speaker today is Mark Schenecker. Mark has more than 2 decades of professional experience developing, designing, and implementing business process solutions, primarily in the high-tech industry. Mark has been with SAP for over 10 years in various development and sales support roles. Currently, Mark heads up business development for SAP Imagineering. He's also the author of 4 patents, a book on e-commerce development platforms, and numerous articles on technology, business process management, software development, and cloud integration. And at this point, I'm going to let Mark take it away. Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Jake. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of an unusual path. So SAP and Splash and Build are new solutions that will be released. So this is, the caveat here is that this is the current state of planning at SAP, and can be changed. What I'm going to do, though, is take you through and kind of reset for the audience. And notice that most everyone, or 87% of the attendees, have seen Fiori or personas, and so you have a background. We'll reset a little bit on what you can do with SAP screens, and then that'll set the stage for why we created Splash and Build. So where I'd like to start this with is basically trying to answer the question, how did we get here? I mean, how did we get to this point in SAP's evolution of a screen? And you have to kind of go back to 1970 when SAP started, and it was really primarily a financial transaction solution. But over time, our customers have pushed us to add more functionality, add more fields, add more business processes. Of course, SAP as a company has grown to support 24 different vertical industries. And then what happened is really SAP expanded out, from ERP into supply chain and product lifecycle management, HR. And as we basically went about creating all of these screens, the way that it was designed was we kept adding to the existing transaction. So today we have about 12,000 transactions, but there's roughly 500,000 screens inside of SAP. Now we're not exactly sure how many screens have been created, but this is a rough estimate of somewhere around 400,000 to 500,000. What's happened, though, and I come from really a B2B background. When I first integrated with SAP, some 15 years ago, I was using an Orders 05 document. So this is just a purchase order, a standard, kind of the first interface that you use to buy products from your partners or to sell products to your customers. There's 3,500 fields in a PO. Now I can't imagine using 35 or 40 different fields, but what's happened is that we basically have added, for example, functionality. If you're in the medical industry or utilities, there's a whole set of fields around declaring radioactive substances. If you're in the agricultural fields, you'll find that there's expiration dates. My background is more in the high-tech industry around processors and memory, where really, individual discrete components don't have an expiration date. So what's happened, though, is that SAP has conveniently and quite generously provided all of those fields to you. So you get all 3,500 fields. We put them in our VA01, 02, 03 interface, and you make and use the ones that you need. So it's not like we haven't tried to simplify this interface. There's been 140 approximately different teams inside of SAP over the years. Now this is spanning some 20 years from what I am aware of, where we have attempted to provide the ability to configure the interface for users. So I mean, so this is more past, you've done the implementation. At an implementation point, there is really a fairly robust, we'll call it a switch framework to configure the interface. But once you have it up and running, we've really tried in individual teams to adjust SAP's interface. Now, this has changed really from a top-down. What we've come to realize is that we have a solution, and we provided a screen to serve 24 industries, 140 countries, and different regionalizations, and many different roles. And we've come to find out one size doesn't fit all. So really from our CDO down, its Fiori concept was born. And this also came out of a topic we're going to cover today briefly called design thinking. So we really do have a solution that is remarkably complex, but that doesn't mean that the SAP user interface has to be complex. So we really want to take a look at how do we take SAP GUI and what is it that we can do to make this interface more productive or more efficient for our users. To do that, we kind of got to look at basically, how do we run simple? And in this case, how do we run really simple? And when looking at the interfaces available today and the techniques that are coming out, what's happened is the SAP interface, and I saw the response to the poll, 94% of the respondents, or 94% of the people on this call are challenged by the SAP interface. And in due part, it's because we provided enormous complexity, much more than a typical role it requires. So when you look at mobile transactions and you look at your phone and you see there's a dozen applications on my phone that I regularly use, but they're small. I can't for the life of me think how I would ever get an ME51N, onto my phone. However, if I had just, the micro application, in other words, just that little soundbite of software that I need to perform my role inside of a company, then it's a completely different, discussion. So we really have come from a world where we've been raised on and really trained on sound bites. And it started with the press and journalism, and basically you can see it today in American politics. Enormously complex discussions distilled down into, one or two words or a phrase. So what we want to do is how do we apply those principles, and can we apply them to SAP? So what we think we can do is we can take and say, hey, we'll just create a microtransaction of a T code. So can I just create the functionality I need from my user view rather than say, hey, from a top-level view, SAP is expanding into another industry, so I get another 200 fields added into my Orders 05 IDOC and into my interface. And really take and say, yes, I understand that we might need all the fields. Power users won't let us change the transactions or simplify them. However, what I can do is offer alternatives and say that there should be multiple views to the SAP interface. So one of the perspectives of a consumer experience, and something that's really affected us quite a bit at SAP, is this evolution. And in 2005, as an example, this is a picture of the Vatican. This was the election of Pope Benedict XVI. Now, this is quite a sacred, it's a solemn event. 8 years later, here's roughly the same photograph of the Vatican, and you can see the inclusion of phones as a natural part of people's way of experiencing the world. I mean, when Pope Francis was elected, and this is, you think about the solemn part of this event, this is a man basically being declared a saint when he rises to sainthood. And the phone and the tablet, or basically the devices around it, are there to record it, to experience it, to remember it. So this is the consumer interface that we have to look at as being a natural part of what we are using going forward. So let's get down to the mechanics of it. With SAP Screen Personas, and this is part of the Fiori solution portfolio, and I'm going to use SAP Screen Personas today. You can use Fiori in the same concept. This is just a little bit easier to demo. And I want to basically set the stage for how you can change SAP screens, and then how and why we would use Splash and Build behind that. So on the left, we really have one GUI to serve all users. And so that T code is designed to address all the industries, all the roles, all the countries, and geographic variations. Basically, one macro transaction. And really what we want to get down to is, how do we distill one version for a specific user group, and how do I put that in the hands of my customers and my SAP partners to make that happen? So, and that's what Screen Personas does. So how does it work? What we're really going to do, we'll take and we'll deconstruct the SAP interface. So SAP GUI is really a set of layers. And like that bottom layer in this illustration is, think of that as the base layer of a piece of paper. That's the bottom layer. All SAP GUI, SAP GUI screens have that layer. We then add a layer with buttons. We had another layer with a menu. Another layer with a tab. So when I was developing, if I got a specification, and you kind of wonder, well, wait a minute, if we have 12,000 T codes, how come we have 500,000 screens? Well, a tab is really a screen in SAP in the development side. And so I got specifications from product management. I was really building onto that tab. And what you'll see is there's a limitation. We have a physical limit in development to how many tabs, and it all depends on how the tabs are arranged. But let's say it's around 9 or 10 tabs across. And when we run out of room for tabs, we actually just create more tabs inside of tabs. And that's the secret to SAP's growth and really the increased complexity of the screens. So with Screen Personas, what we're going to do is we're going to deconstruct these layers. We're going to just hide the functionality that we don't need. This is not designed, it's not like Fiori where we're basically doing back-end development. We can't introduce new fields. This is all about basically just making the functionality that we need available. And we'll do that with a WYSIWYG editor. I've been able to use that phrase for many years. And let's take a look at what customers have done with it. So these are examples of customers and customers working with partners to create a screen that makes sense for their business. Now these are all really primarily kind of the menu, or basically the initial experience that you have going into SAP. Certainly dramatically different than the ECC screen that most people use today for their login. So let's just jump in. What I want to do is a quick demonstration of SAP Screen Personas, just to show you how we can change the screens. So I'm going to share my browser instance. And you should be able to see on your screen now an SAP ECC instance. So I'm on the main menu. No surprise here if I jump out to VAO2, it's a standard transaction. So if in this screen, what's happened is I've actually modified this. These are different flavors. I'm basically simulating a Fiori Launchpad. I've got my kids pretty excited about going to the new Star Wars movie, so I created a theme based on Star Wars. And all of these took about 15 minutes to create. I even created a value-based experience and left the control screens in the front. So, but let's go into a transaction. Let me just do IEO3. If I go into this transaction, let's look up a product or a computer in this particular case, a very big computer, and let's get the data displayed. What I want to do is say, there are 3 tabs. Actually, I've already eliminated 4 of the tabs on this. So I started with 7 tabs. I really only want the general data for this for my user role. The rest of the interface I don't need. So just a very simple, editing of this. I want to do is a very simple screen. Let's go ahead and just move into edit mode. So in this particular case, I'm disconnecting from the back end, and I'm actually using this screen in the same way I would kind of use like PowerPoint. So let's do this.
Hi,
let's
Mark, I'm sorry to jump in. I've got a couple comments that the screen is loading just a little bit slowly, so if you can go through it just a little more slowly as you're describing it, that'll help people catch up on the graphics. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that. So what I've done on this screen is I grabbed in, hopefully you're on the IE03 screen. We'll get out of the demo here in just a second and get back into kind of introducing Splash and Build as soon as we're done here. I'm just going to grab this data. I'm going to take the tabs, and I'm just going to hide them. I want this general data available. I'm just dragging and dropping this somewhere on the screen. I don't need for this particular user role, I don't need the buttons, so I'll go ahead and I'll hide those. In fact, there's a number of unused buttons on the top. They're actually grayed out. So just to help the user, I'll go ahead and let's hide those. So I'm going to save this, and let me exit. So when I exit the edit mode, what should come up on the screen momentarily is my new screen, okay? So this screen is basically now been distilled down into, what, a dozen fields. These are the fields that I need for my specific role, okay? Now, I still have, behind the scenes, I still have the normal, full-blown transaction, right, as it was implemented on this particular box, right, in this particular implementation or instance of ECC. But this instance I just created, right, is now been simplified dramatically. Now, I can go to the next steps. I can basically make this look like a Fiori screen, and that takes a little bit more time in terms of drawing colors, lines, and basically creating what looks like SAP UI5 controls. So just a little bit more detailed time. So let's go back to the slide deck for a second, and if I can hit that, there we go. And Jake, do we have the slides back on, just to confirm? Okay. Let me just navigate to the next slide. There we go. So this is an example on the left-hand side of an SAP screen persona, or basically a standard ECC screen. And on the right-hand side, I basically created a Fiori transaction or Fiori look for that transaction. I greatly simplified. I don't need 10 tabs. What I really want to understand in this production order is where I'm at in the process. So I actually created a line chart, and basically showing me where I'm at in that process itself. So if I look at and basically say, where are we at with enterprise software, right? This is a study that was done just a few years ago, and it basically is a report card on the state of enterprise software. And it is a remarkably sobering report that, on average, only one person in 10 would consider their enterprise software to be above average. There's incredible amounts of room for improvement. So the real question that comes to mind is, and the reason I wanted to set up this quick review of screen personas and Fiori, is that you can now change the SAP interface. You can change any SAP GUI screen out there for ECC, and for S4HANA, you would use Fiori to create your own experiences. Now, the question is, what should you change, and why would you change it? And will it work? Will it be productive for the users? So really what's happened is we've created a tool, and then basically now we have to step back and say, okay, now SAP is getting involved in the design space. And this is where Splash and Build comes in. So about 10 years ago, we started using a methodology called design thinking. It's been around for a number of years. The first book on this actually goes back to 1987. The last 5 years has really been a dramatic acceleration of the use of design thinking at SAP. And if I look at the challenges that we have today, if I'm basically saying, here's how we can change and modify, an SAP screen, if I sit down and say, okay, we can do anything we want. We can change fields, we can change colors, we can move things around. Now I sit down with my users and my customer and say, this is what they explain. So I write that down. I then, when I write it, I put it into a design spec, right, which turns out to be different than what I started with. What was developed, of course, comes out quite a bit different. And in the end, what the customer really wanted is not what was explained. So when you look at this as an old diagram, it's certainly an old concept. I hand drew these for illustrative purposes. But the idea is that if we're going to look at and understand correctly how to change SAP screens, we have to back up and say, okay, what are the criteria that we need? What are the specifications, and how do we actually build those specifications? So design thinking, and the hard part is, being a programmer is I would talk to the users, and then really it was my point of view. I'd start coding long before I really started designing, when in reality, the rule today is that you should really spend 80% of your time doing the design, the perfection of that design, the testing, the usability, the feedback, and then spend the last 20% coding. And what design thinking does is basically try to put that into practice. So in this case, we say put that user in the middle, right, and make everything about that user, and then understand the different teams around that, whether it's the operations team, the domain experts, your partners, your customers, your other team members that you work with around that end user. What is the interaction that they have with those other constituents or stakeholders, and then bring about basically the design. So there's a couple of kind of philosophical parts to design thinking, which I think are really quite important to understand. One is that when you do this, they call it relentless optimism, but I like the way that they do the phrase. How could we, or how might we, is an incredibly powerful way to look at the challenges of a user. So instead of saying, hey, I'm going to get involved in the transaction, because SAP is all about T codes, in reality, a user doesn't go home and say, gee, I just learned how to use ME51N today. Isn't that great? And I dream about T codes at night. That's not the user's world. The user's world is around the functional parts of that. So when we go in and basically say, how could we change this, right? So that's a first part of this ideation. The last part of it is everything is a bias towards, how do we put these ideas into play? So you basically create your concepts, assess them, and then bring it to life, but more importantly, do that in the context with many, many people. So the process of design thinking, I think this is a pretty good illustrative part of this, is first, you need to create your problem statement. Understand that, what is it that you're trying to change? Well, as an example, my customers say the wait time or the resolution time on a call in customer service takes too long. You look at it and say 8 minutes. The reps are frustrated with the amount of data that they have to search and sift through. The customers are on hold waiting. Okay, now you have an understanding or a concept of the problem. Next is you're going to observe or take a look at these users in situ, right, in context of their day-to-day work. Define points of view, of the user, of the customer, of the other constituents around that user, and then start to ideate. Only at that point do you start to basically say, how can we solve that problem? We'll look at this a little bit closer. Also then into prototyping. So instead of building words on paper and hoping that what you create is correct, a cornerstone of design thinking is to create a working prototype, because that is the ultimate specification. It's exactly, you're asking for something that, number one, can be coded, can be developed, and number two, represents exactly what you're trying to achieve and has been validated by test. Now, why invest in such a long process? And this is another, kind of old study. And it basically is that the farther along this process that you make a change, the more expensive it is. So the idea is that up front, it might cost, as an example, $1 to make a change to your observations or your point of view. At the end, if you're trying to change it after it's already in production, it's 75 times more expensive. So I look at enterprise software no different than say, an aircraft flight. If I have a problem with the aircraft, then I've already gone down the runway, I've taxied, I've gone, I've lifted, I'm in the air, and we basically say, you know what, we've got to fix this aircraft. It's quite expensive to then take the aircraft in flight, land it, taxi back in, bring the parts, and make the change. So enterprise software is no different. Once you've launched and you have it in flight, it's quite a bit more expensive to get that running. So what we want to do is really think like a designer, and more so than a developer. And this is hard. This is not the typical skills that you find inside a corporation, and this is where we rely pretty heavily on partners and on basically new resources. And what we do is we try and separate the problem space from the solution space, because developers are really from the solution world. This is where I live. This is where you basically look at, well, how could I code this? What tools can I use? What IDE am I going to be engaged in? So in the problem space, you start with, basically creating your ideas, many different types of ideas, but you then work through those and converge on this is what we need to get done. And then you go through the same exact cycle on the solution space. So this is how we kind of basically combine, designing and developing. So how do we get down to the basics? How do I convert then design thinking, into some tooling that I can use? And this is where Splash and Build come in. So on the left-hand side, I take and say, I'm going to, turn this into kind of three major parts of this. It's designing, coming up with what is that we want to create, creating that prototype, then getting user feedback. That's what the center is. It's basically showing you where the users click on the screen, and then providing a very precise set of specifications to the SAP developers about what to make. So in this Build and Splash world, converting basically that design thinking approach, we start with design. We're going to use the tooling, or basically the parts in the Learning Center in Splash. We're going to create interactive prototypes. We'll do that in just a few moments. We'll get feedback from the users on those prototypes, and then we'll iterate and make a better prototype until finally we have something where we can say, okay, development, here is a working model of what we want built, right, or what we want changed or created with either screen personas or SAP Fiori. And we can even give you the starter code to get that going. So in the, just kind of go back to design thinking where Splash and Build fit. Splash is really kind of going over the first, 4 parts of this. To me, Build is really a functional component of Splash. I mean, it's really, to me, 2 sides of the same coin, because it's just one part of the process, right? So let's jump in and just take a quick look at Splash and Build, their specs, and then we'll go into the product. So Splash is available. It's a website solution. It starts with basically method cards and best practices. It basically is the documentation tooling. It's got questionnaires and examples for how to use and implement design thinking. So design thinking then is the methodology. Splash basically is tooling that's giving you the ability to create, and move through design thinking. The cornerstone to me of Splash is a learning center. And you start with, here's the methods, and, talking to the users, this is where you've gone from understanding the problem, now you're getting into observing, right? Synthesizing those findings, creating the persona, right? Defining that point of view. These are all the classical steps inside of design thinking. Now, once you've done that, your next step is, okay, what should we build? Because that's really the design part. Now the build part says you can't just put that in a piece of paper and call that a spec and hand it to development, right, as in the past. Instead, you build the prototype or a wireframe, right? and provide that to your user community, get feedback long before you give it to development for execution. So in Build, you're basically taking those brainstorming, and you could build many different prototypes. Basically, the idea is to diverge, right, create different prototypes, to really converge onto one that is solving the problem that you're iterating through. So the part that's kind of interesting, you can start with something quite simple. So this is a prototype. I drew this as an example. You can see this is my graphic design skills on display. And you can start with this as a low-fidelity prototype and very quickly ascertain whether or not you've got the right fields, you've got the right flow. Does this make sense before you jump into the next step, which is to leverage, in this case, I want to leverage the gallery and build a high-fidelity prototype. So I'm going to use SAP UI5 controls, build a high-fidelity prototype, and again, iterate. Okay. Now the purpose of this is if I can, use these controls, right, build this prototype or design this prototype, it is something that can be coded. Okay, that's an important step because sometimes we design things that we can't necessarily build, right? So let's do this. This prototype is, a picture is worth 1,000 words. A prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. There's many people that this phrase has been attributed to, and I just picked one of our movie stars for that. So let's do this. Let's go in and go back to the web browser. And what I'm going to do is jump into Build. So I have, you should see this come up on the screen. I'll go a little bit slower. Hopefully we can get through this, right? Is a set of projects in Build that I've already created. So let me just open up my toy catalog project. I've got some hand-drawn images in here. And what I've done is I'm going to open up this project. This is Build. So this is my prototype editor. And you should see this dark blue around a hand-drawn screen. So I've created, in this particular case, a product catalog. It's my, what I wanted to do. This is a very simple example, obviously. And what I've done is I've also then created a second screen, right? And if I go to the second page of this, it is a product detail. So if I click on one of the products, it'll take me into the detail. So I've drawn a couple of hot spots on this. You can kind of see this light green area on the bottom. If I go into a preview mode, right, now the solution is live. This looks like a set of web pages. You should see the product catalog up. I click on the xylophone, and it takes me to the product details page. I'll pause here for a second because I want to make sure that the screen has a chance to catch up. I can then, at this point, I also create a hot link that basically takes me back to the product catalog. Now, that is the idea here is it's very, very simple, right? It's not meant to be complicated. It's really to start with something very low fidelity. But basically, is this what we're talking about? It basically take what we're talking about in design, just write it down very quickly and figure out if that's what we can do. So now, the next step, if I go into my projects, I then took my prototype and in this case, what I did was I translated my prototype and I actually imported some data from my production system. That's what this is. I used a list control. I inserted some graphics images into this table. And I also created my product details page, right? You can see that from the user feedback, I've got more feedback in here, right? And in fact, I even built out my third page, which is reviews. And this is basically a review of that specific product. So if I go into, for a moment, let me just go into the actual working instance. Now we start to see that this starts to feel and look like an application. And I can go in and take a look at, let's say we look at the review from NC. I can go back And I've got my navigational aspects, I've got fields, I've got color and style. I'm starting to get to a high-fidelity prototype. Now, I'm not connected to a back end. I just use an Excel spreadsheet to load data. I'm not connected to my ECC instance. The whole point of this is basically to say, this is what I want to see on the screen. This is what I want to use. Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is just for sake of time is let me just go back and take you into the next step, right? So now when I'm putting that prototype out there, the key part of the solution is integrated user feedback. And this is where I give the prototype, I send it out, and I give tasks. And I basically just use email. I send it to the power users. I can send it to a selected user set. You can give them the ability to share it with other people as well. And basically what comes back is, they answer my questions and tell me, what they think of that product. And also, as part of this, I get a heat map, for example, where did they click on the screen. In a design, I may look at this and say, I didn't get the feedback that, hey, the third option here in the top center is actually the most used. Well, and since this is being developed in the Western Hemisphere, this block should probably be top left. Why do I have it in the middle center where you have to hunt for it a little bit longer? So if I want to raise my user productivity, I start to use the heat map to understand, how to make this better. And then I turn around and say, okay, we've got a working prototype, we've gotten our user feedback, and what I want to do then is jumpstart development. And in this particular case, the code generator, in this case, it's generating the starter code, I'll call it that. But more importantly, the working prototype is what you're handing to development. And in this case, I just hand a working prototype to my screen personas development, or I can hand the working prototype and the starter code to my Fiori development team, and they'll import, and this gets imported into Web IDE. So the solution names, I wanted to just cover this real quickly because it does get confusing. There are new product names here, and also this is a completely new space. I mean, SAP Enterprise Software, and here we are building a tool that supports a methodology, Splash, and a wireframing tool that basically says, I'm going to build screens. And you can't call these enterprise software. They're clearly tools for creating better software experiences, right? So this is a completely new area for SAP. So when we look at design thinking, right, we start with Splash, and we're very quickly overlaying that with Build, and it's going to flow into screen personas when I go into development or Fiori, right? And I'm using at this point, I'll be using the UI theme designer, because if I'm using the SAP UI5 controls, you're going to get that Fiori look and feel with SAP Web IDE. So the principles behind this, the design principles that we're really trying to bring to bear in trying to take these enormously broad, complex transactions and say, make them role-based, design specifically for a user or for a set of users, support them, and make it responsive in how they work and where they work. But keep it simple, right? Focus on what's important. So, and more importantly, keep it coherent as well. So SAP develops solutions where I've got, HR functionality in, just that area, and if you wanted to combine something in HR with data from finance, that's just not something you're going to see in an SAP transaction. When you build out, a screen persona or a Fiori app, you don't have boundaries of supply chain, PLM, SCM, CRM, ERP. You can pull data and functionality from anywhere. But the notion is that make the experience something that instead of make it delightful, make it something that is functional specifically for that user in that role at that point in time. So what we're really moving from today is just this very complex, broad transaction into another set of screens, or basically transactions that are a subset micro transactions designed specifically for what a user needs. So and I want to be careful because a lot of times, especially IT management or LOB management, will look and say, it's one thing, it's nice, the screens look pretty, but that doesn't really, for my business. But the response in terms of gaining productivity, of basically taking that 8-minute, customer service example and turning it into a 3-minute, customer service example is real money and real value achieved, right? And there's numerous documented cases of doing that. And at the same time, getting the soft benefit of increasing, customer satisfaction, user adoption, lower training costs. I mean, that's why people implement, a new user experience. That's why they make that investment. So there's quite a number of resources. In fact, it's overwhelming, the amount of data that's out there. But you can start your UX journey if you want to learn more about user experience. The folks at NIMBL have an extraordinarily experienced practice around user experience, both design and implementation. You can take and calculate, before you start that project, what the value is. But you can learn more about design thinking, SAP screen personas. You can even sign up for the beta of Splash and Build at no cost. So, and the licensing part of this is really quite remarkable. I mean, screen personas is a part of your license. It's part of your NetWeaver license. If you have a NetWeaver implementation, you have a license to screen personas. And in all likelihood, we'll see Splash and Build pricing when it's released later this year. So with that, I want to kind of open this up to questions and stop the formal slide.